Right, let's make a start, shall we? So, good afternoon and welcome. This session sits at the heart of what People's Powerhouse is all about. Because today is really one core idea. It's when people are genuinely listened to, real change happens. So everything that we explore in this conversation connects back to that. How lived experience, community action, research and policy come together, not in theory, but in practice, to create meaningful impact. That's what underpins our coast-to-coast listening work and everything we're building towards across the North. Creating the conditions where people are heard and where those voices shape decisions, not just inform them. We're today joined by two people who embody that connection between lived experience and system change. Andrew Forsey OBE is Director of Feeding Britain, where he has led national work tackling food insecurity through practical community-led solutions. His work starts by listening to what people are experiencing on the ground and turning that lived experience into evidence, advocacy, and ultimately policy change. Alongside it, Greta Defeyter OBE is Professor of Health Nutrition, Director of the Healthy Living Lab, and a Dean at Northumbria University. Her work begins by listening to the lived experiences of children and families and turning those realities into evidence that shapes how systems understand and respond to food insecurity. Together, Andrew and Greta show how listening becomes action, from community insight to evidence to real change. Not just listening as an exercise, but listening as a driver of action. Before we begin, a quick note. We have a Q&A and we have a chat, so please introduce yourself in the chat just so we can see who's in the room. And also use the Q&A option to post questions throughout and upvote those who you most want to hear about. So the best questions you see, please upvote them in the Q&A and we'll make sure those questions get asked to Andrew and Greta throughout today. We'll be grounding each question in real voices from the coast to coast work, so everything that we say and everything that's discussed stays rooted in that lived experience. And with that, let's begin. Andrew, the floor is yours.
James, thank you very much indeed. And may I begin by thanking you, Rima and Abby at People's Powerhouse for making possible this afternoon's conversation. I can only beg people who have joined us this afternoon not to read too much into the fact that Greta and I were invited to present on April Fool's Day of all days. But that aside, the timing for this afternoon's conversation could barely have been more fortunate or pertinent, because it was 121 years ago this week that an MP called Arthur Henderson, who had grown up here in Newcastle, who had worked in Stevenson's works on the banks of the Tyne, brought to Parliament one of the very first legislative attempts to introduce a national school meals programme across the country. By that time, Arthur had been elected to represent the Barnard Castle constituency. And such was the head of steam built up around that and similar legislative efforts in 1905 that a year later in 1906, of course, the government responded by introducing its own legislation, which did give effect to a national school meals programme. But sticking with our North East theme, it was only a short while after that 1906 Act became law that the Education Authority here in Newcastle was one of, if not the first local authorities to lodge an official appeal with the government for this new legislation to apply across the whole calendar year rather than during term time only. In other words, they wanted to make sure that children growing in poverty or on the fringes of poverty could be supported during the holidays as well as when they were at school. And it's really in that spirit that Greta and I are going to be speaking over these next few minutes. And if it's okay with all of you, we're going to break down our conversation into three parts. First, our work with children, young people, their families and wider communities around school holiday provision. Second, our work to co-locate services in underserved communities where and when they are most needed. And third, our work to develop affordable food club models as part of a layered strategy to help end our country's mass dependence on emergency food parcels from food banks. So starting with the campaign against holiday hunger, if you like, from my own perspective, that began in around 2014. When I had the privilege of working with an MP called Frank Field, God rest his soul. And it was around that time that Frank was speaking with his constituents who were hungry and those groups within Birkenhead constituency who were feeding hungry people by setting up food banks around what it was that had left them hungry in the first place. And what we found in having those conversations and in asking those questions is that, yes, in Birkenhead, but also across Merseyside and in as far afield as Cornwall, Salisbury and elsewhere, there was particular pressure being exerted on family budgets during the school holidays. Yes, in the absence of those term time supports like free school meals and in some cases free school breakfasts, but then of course with that barrage of additional costs that families faced, not simply to keep their children fed, but also occupied and entertained. If it's okay with all of you, I'm just going to give a couple of direct quotes that were given to us around that time. So this was from a food bank volunteer up here in Northumberland, who said around the school holidays, quotes, "When low-income families in receipt of free school meals have to buy much more food when the kids are off school, I've spoken to a few mums around here whose weekly shop during the school holidays is 3 times what it usually is." And then going down to one of those food banks in Salisbury, who told us that in the summer holidays in particular, we see families facing the daunting prospect of 6 weeks without being able to feed their children. And we, in fact, saw a 45% increase in families in the summer of 2013 due to the loss of the 1 meal a day which the free school meal provides. So on the back of those early conversations in around 2014-15, Frank convened a series of parliamentary inquiries, one of which focused specifically on this increased hardship that we were seeing in the holidays. And as part of that, Frank invited a group of families from Birkenhead to come to the Houses of Parliament in Westminster to speak their truth to power. And they sat in one of those horseshoe-like formats that you see in the Select Committee corridor, just detailing to MPs the reality of life on a low income, all year round, of course, but particularly in the school holidays. And I'll never forget the moment when this group of mums came through security in the House of Commons and chucks all of their rucksacks and their anoraks over me. So I was walking around covered in them, barely been able to see through this gap in the coats as something of a human coat rack for the afternoon. But I thought there was the embodiment of us being there to facilitate those parents' opportunities to speak truth to power. And so from that parliamentary perspective, with inquiry after inquiry, round of evidence after round of evidence, we were able to start shaping and crafting some legislative proposals for what could be done to counter this hardship and need that we were seeing in the school holidays. The bill took the form of something called the School Holidays, Meals and Activities Bill that was presented in 2017. And because we played our cards right, the government accepted the thrust and the contents of that bill in 2018 and began rolling out taxpayer-funded support in the school holidays that was called the Holiday Activities and Food Programme. But that's just a partial account of the, if you like, the parliamentary side of the campaign. And so I'm going to hand over to Greta at this point, if I may, whose own work and research around school holiday provision, the lack thereof as it was back then, played a crucial role likewise in shaping those parliamentary efforts and securing that government commitment. So Greta, it's over to you at this point. What was your journey 10, 15 years ago toward that point of gaining the government concession?
Okay. So as an academic, we always like to say that we've read numerous papers and the idea has come out of theory or some paper we've read. But in this case, that would be a complete lie. That's not how the idea is cemented in my head. So before this, I'd been researching school food and school breakfast clubs. I started researching school breakfast clubs over 20 years ago now. So I was quite familiar with how school food worked and how the breakfast club programs were working across the UK. And I was sitting in a meeting room at Westminster talking about school lunches, nothing about holiday provision at all. And a good friend and colleague that I was sitting next to just said to me, I wonder what happens to these children in receipt of free school meals during the holiday period. And I just looked at her and said, I don't know. So I went to have a look to see, as an academic, what's been written about school holiday provision in the UK, to find out there was nothing. Absolutely no papers written really about school holiday provision, what families were having to find in terms of not only income but activities for the children as well as looking at food. So I said, okay, well, I think we should start researching this. And so we started researching it. And within about the first 3 months, the need that was coming from families in our initial pilot studies was so overwhelming. It just absolutely touched me. And I've made it my mission ever since to do work in this area. So our first piece of work we did was actually funded by the lottery. And it looked at actually 7 areas across the Northeast, and we looked at 17 different holiday hubs. Now, this was before the days of the holiday activity and food program funded by government. So these were communities saying, we can see a gap here, we should be doing some work here. So that was our first kind of stab at evaluation. We worked with Children Northeast to look at that program. And immediately we were seeing multiple benefits coming out. So it wasn't just about giving children food. It was providing them with opportunities. It was providing mums a chance of some respite. It was getting children engaged in lots of physical activity and opportunity. So that was our first stab. And remember, no one had really come up with a nice methodology, as we like to say, as academics, to look at this. So it was very much a test and learn for us as well. And at the same time, the APPG, the All-Party Parliamentary Group on School Food, that I was sitting on, said, why don't you do a national survey to see whether this is happening across the UK? Like, no one knew whether it was happening, who was doing it, where it was, nothing. So we did our first national survey, and lo and behold, 478 community organisations were delivering some form of holiday provision. So communities really understood that there was this need. And I think it's a really good example of how you can work with parliamentarians, work with people in communities as academics to galvanize the findings, to really take it up to, speaking truth to power, but providing at the same time government really good research based with working with communities. We don't work with at them, we work with them in communities, we always have. And so from that, I submitted lots of research papers to Frank Field's inquiry. And those papers started to really cement the kind of community voice within what went forward. And then what we did, I met with a whole load of stakeholders down in London, and we actually, this is way back before people were talking about co-design and co-participation. We were doing it. We co-designed the holiday activities and food program with community members, with community organisations, and the DWP and the DFE. In fact, the greatest compliment at the end of the day, someone that worked for DFE said to me at the end of the day, he said, Greta, I've worked so hard, I don't know whether I'm working for the government now or you, because he said, I'm just so bombarded with what you're making me do. But the real importance and why I'm saying that is because it had community voice in the co-design of the program. It meant when the then funding came down from central government into local authorities and communities, it was a pretty good fit. I mean, I didn't get everything I wanted. I never get everything I wanted. I wanted it to be universal for every child. But, you have to dream big, right, sometimes in these things. But because it came down in the right way and it had that community voice, it then landed well in communities where it was delivered. Back to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Greta. And as Greta touched upon there, we had this moment of harmony in 2017-18, where those grassroots voices and practices aligned with what the emerging research told us from academia and with the politics at the time to secure this momentous breakthrough with the government. It was that moment of harmony that made this change of policy possible. And like you said there, Greta, I remember from those early years of the Feeding Britain movement, where they too were starting to try these fun and food clubs during the holidays, that the parental feedback was overwhelmingly positive. Parents quickly said to us they couldn't imagine a world without this kind of provision now. It was like a cornerstone of their life that they could rely upon. As you touched upon, it eased the pressure and lifted some of the burden off their shoulders. For the children and young people, it strengthened existing friendships and made new friendships possible. Improvements in dietary intake were registered and so on. So it was a huge success there. However, I remember fairly soon after the introduction and the rollout of the government-funded programme, Yes, those strengths continue to emerge particularly strongly for children who are at primary school and who are of primary school age, but we weren't yet picking up such strong benefits associated with this programme for young people at secondary school, the 12 to 16-year-old age group. So I remember then you acted very swiftly on that evidence and decided to do something about it. Would you like to talk us through what you did there, Greta?
Yeah. So when we co-designed this program, we thought, right, we've got this licked, everything's fine, but it wasn't. And Andrew's quite right. So when I was looking at the national and regional and local data, the same pattern was showing in all of the data, that this was really a well-attended program by primary school age children. But the teenagers, it didn't really appeal to them. You know, that it wasn't kind of like hitting their needs, so to speak. And so we took the same principles again of co-design, having that community youth voice. And I decided to be even more ambitious in this project. None of these projects, by the way, were funded. All of the academics working on this were just doing it out of their own spare time. So I've just put that out there because I think it's important to say, because no one could get any funding for this early work, because everybody in my world said there's no such thing as holiday hunger. There's not a problem. We don't publish papers on it. And I was saying it's a new thing. That's what science should do. And they say we don't publish it, Greta, so there's no point doing it. So in the early days, we were really struggling to get funding and get published. Once we got on a roll, we were okay. But so what we did with the young people, I decided to base it in the Northeast. So we had young people from Northumberland and Gateshead that came together for a 2-day co-design workshop. We did exactly the same in Birmingham, and we did exactly the same in the borough of Brent in London. And we worked with young people in all of those separate areas, using what we call various design methodology and creative methods, for them to actually look at the current HAF program and then redesign it with, on the second day, adults from the local authorities or the boroughs being in the room, a program that would work for them. Okay. And everybody said to me, that's great, but how do you get a national program to roll out? So what we then did is we had a national co-design sprint down in the Embankment in London, and we took 40 young people from all over the country down for this national co-design sprint. And the idea was really not for me to have my voice, but for the young people to pitch their ideas to parliamentarians and other key stakeholders and NGOs. And they did an absolutely fantastic job. I mean, there was a young lad I remember really well. He said to me, Greta, he said, I've never been on the big train to London before. And I said, that's all right. What I didn't tell him is I actually booked them all first class tickets, and they all went first class. I think probably a few stockbrokers or whatever weren't very happy with it, but it doesn't matter. So in each area, the young people then designed this HAP program that adhered to all of the policy guidelines from the government, because we want them to eat healthy food. We want them to engage in activities, but we want them to do things that appeal to them. And they came up with slightly different solutions. But overall, it fitted within a national framework. And I'll just give you an example of what they did in Gateshead, because it's really quite innovative. So young people in Gateshead said, okay, there's a couple of things we need to think about, because we're going to design this program for all of the young people in Gateshead. And that's important to say, because we can use design methods where they're not designing for themselves, they're designing for everybody. So it's important to think about how it's better. And then what we did is the young people that were in Gateshead said, our key point of meeting is the Metro Centre. So let's take over a disused shop in the Metro Centre. So we went with young people and we negotiated that, and we got a free shop to use in the Metro Centre for the whole summer. Then they said, well, okay, we need places to eat. So we went with the young people and we negotiated really good deals at restaurants. In fact, 2 of the restaurants actually just provided young people with the food for free. And my job was to check it complied to being healthy and nutritious, right? And then the young people said, oh, this is quite good, but we want to go to other things as well. So we negotiated with the council for the young people for the whole of the holiday period to get free travel on the train, the bus, or the metro. all not just to go to the holiday activities, but to go wherever they wanted during the holiday, and they just showed their pass and went onto the metro. The following year, we were still working with the young people, and we went back and we actually negotiated more restaurants to come on board, and one of them was actually Greg's. And what one of my nutritional science members did is went through the whole Greg's menu, and we made sure that we looked at foods that Greg's can serve that do meet the school food standards. So we worked with Greg's and the young people to develop an app so they could go into any Greg's just on their phone and actually order their sandwich. So nobody knew that they were getting a special deal. It just looked like they were ordering correctly on their phone. Since then, we've looked in London. London, we've currently got 238 organisations feeding into the London programme in terms of businesses. We've got museums. And all of that really came out of the young people saying that the kind of programme as it is for HAF works well for younger children, doesn't work well for us. The most recent thing we've done is we've done some work with young people where they want to actually have work experience, have opportunities around social networking. And that's the current thing we're doing. So we're going to be announcing very shortly a contextual offer at the university, my university. So young people that have been involved in the program can come to university with a slightly lower offer. We're also working with businesses of guaranteeing work placement and a guaranteed job interview at the end of it, and many, many more.
So here we can see in the development of that model where a second note of harmony has been struck between those grassroots voices and practices, what the research is telling you around what can work and where the need exists, and that governmental blessing given to this reformed model of school holiday support for 13 to 16-year-olds. Because here we can now see very clearly the development and the creation of a programme where it's been shaped by the voices from the grassroots that extends to many hundreds of thousands of children and young people now, that sense of freedom and opportunity that you just described that may previously have been denied to them. And perhaps I might return to holiday provision and or school food if time permits. But moving on to our second area of joint activity, Greta, and again starting with those early Feeding Britain inquiries of a decade or so ago, I dug out earlier today the notebook that I used back then to jot down all of the details that have been shared with those inquiries by families who were living with hunger or the risk of hunger. And what came through rereading these notes very vividly were the shortcomings that citizens were sharing with us around the need constantly to describe and open up about one's own circumstances and story to agency after agency, in office after office, in phone call after phone call, in form after form, if they were to access anything resembling adequate support with the cost of living and other issues. And there was a food bank I remember in Cornwall that gave evidence to that inquiry to say, look, we're sending people round the houses and back again. So we see them Friday after Friday coming back time and time again for emergency food parcel after emergency food parcel. Why can't those services that we're sending people around the houses to visit actually come here, where and when they're needed at the first time of asking at the food bank, so that there's someone coming through my door only has to share their story once, and that will immediately unlock the help that is so vitally necessary if they're to help themselves out of a rut. And so that guided one of Feeding Britain's early programmes to try and co-locate as many services as is appropriate under one roof to help people more quickly and effectively. But you, Greta, have a very powerful story along similar lines here in Newcastle, which has shaped a brilliant example of how to do this effectively with different parts of the public sector as well. Do you want to share that with us?
Sure. So I was seeing exactly the same thing that Andrew's just talked about, people having to repeat their stories. And sometimes people like to repeat their stories, right? I love repeating my stories. I'm of an age where, I'll tell you my story any day of the week, right? Or trauma, then you don't necessarily want to have to keep repeating your story. You want somebody to help you. You need to get the support. And it became really clear to me that obviously we need reform to welfare and what good work looks like and what a fair wage, a real living wage looks like. But on top of that, in terms of those households and families that find themselves using food aid provision, it just occurred to me that when I was looking at some of our food banks that were delivering at that stage, and I worked with the West End Food Bank, one of the largest food banks in the UK, to say, how can we do this differently? How can we have a system that doesn't rely on another charity coming in and giving charitable help, and that you're only there on a Tuesday afternoon, for example, and if that person can't come on a Tuesday afternoon, then they miss the appointment. So I worked with the West End Food Bank and Newcastle City Council, and they were really smart, because what we did is we put food insecurity under adult safeguarding. Right? Now that's important, because adult safeguarding is a mandatory service. And what we did, we then went to the council and worked with the council and the food bank. So when a person was went to the food bank, they made they had a whole kind of like case, person-centered file about them that went up into the council via the food bank, who were trained on the council services, and then it went across all council services. So housing, food, debt advice, public health, the whole thing went straight across. So the person only had to tell their story once, and then it went up and across all services. Now, when this was first introduced, Newcastle Council, I think, were a little bit spooked, because their adult safeguarding cases went through the roof. And I said, but those people were already there. You just hadn't captured them. They're not new people. They're already there. And so what we did is we held the kind of like the course, and within 3 months, those adult safeguarding cases had dropped right back down below baseline. And the system across the whole council actually only costs £50,000, which isn't very much. It's now called Safeguarding Newcastle Against Poverty. In general, overall, on 6 months evaluation, it saved users just short of £1 million in terms of benefits. Yeah. So, and it's the nice thing about it to me is it's an equitable service. So they're now rolling the program out. It's called Safeguarding Newcastle Against Poverty. And I'm really pushing hard for all local authorities to look at this as a way of working, because it reduces the strain that the state is putting on the charitable sector. Over to you, Andrew.
And as you say there, Greta, here in the Northeast and elsewhere now, it's almost commonplace to see within community food projects, including but not limited to food banks, things around debt, cutting your energy bills, resolving council tax or housing issues, health checks, credit union saving schemes, brought within the reach of people they're there to serve, but that have been previously out of reach. So it's been so effective at getting more money quickly into people's pockets and helping people stretch their money further. And a third shared area of work, Greta, on which you and I have been active in recent years, in my mind at least, owes its origins to, again, some of those conversations I was having 10 to 12 years ago in those parliamentary inquiries, when the importance of agency and choice really came to the fore when it comes to accessing food and other essentials. That inherent sense we all have of wanting to buy our own food and choose our own food if we're going to go shopping. And one conversation in particular down in Essex stayed with me when a group of citizens chose to set up their own affordable food club or community supermarket. And they were there on the first morning, and they said, you know what, mate, where we live here, you can see we don't have any of those bigger supermarkets. You've got to get the bus out to the bigger supermarkets. We've got that guy with his corner shop, but he charges through the nose, and the stuff he sells isn't that much good anyway. You won't see us at the food bank. We don't want to go and get a food parcel. But by having this affordable food club where we can all come together, we've got those bargains, we've got that choice, the prices are reasonable on what we can afford, and because we're all coming here as members, we can all have a good old gossip in the process. And I remember that conversation, and also conversations with some of the food banks themselves 10 to 12 years ago, who said to us, look, can we make a plea to you as you're developing this Feeding Britain movement, that you help us as food banks go back to our original mission, which was to put our loving arm around the shoulder of a most tiny handful of people in our community who literally have nothing, and who, by tiding over with food parcels and giving them all of our love and care, we can help gently back onto their feet. Because they said what we weren't set up to do was to provide more and more food parcels to a lengthening queue of people in and out of work who have an income, but whose income is just insufficient for them to access and afford what they need from a supermarket. And so that's where really the seed was planted in our minds around the potential efficacy of these affordable food club or community supermarket models. And I wondered, of course, Greta, given that you and I are both privileged to be involved with one such scheme here in the North East, the St Chad's Community Market in Gateshead, if you could similarly share your thoughts, experience and involvement with this Affordable Food Club programme.
Yeah, so the affordable food clubs, which translate into quite a wide range of models of delivery. So when we're talking about affordable food clubs, we're talking about pantries, social supermarkets, just so everybody's very clear. So the idea being that you either go and shop via tokens like, red diamonds or red hearts and diamonds and things like that, or you actually pay a nominal amount of membership per week, and for that you get a return of your shopping that's normally about anything between about 20 to 30 pounds for 5 to 10 pounds spent. So it varies a little bit across different models, but the idea is you pay a small amount and you can then go and shop in a social supermarket or a pantry. Okay. The evidence around them at the moment, and it's still fairly early days, but there is strong evidence that the number of food banks, and this is based on government data, is slowly dropping, and the number of affordable food clubs is actually starting to rise. What we don't know yet, and what we've got to look at, is whether the rise in the numbers of affordable food clubs is because people are using food banks less and then using affordable food clubs, or whether affordable food clubs are just attracting another part of our population that never had access to a food bank in the first place, but have food insecurity. Does that make sense to everybody? So we're not quite sure yet of the population, but we can see some things. We've also done research into some of the other benefits of it, and most people talk about dignity and choice and reducing stigma, but we can also see benefits in terms of public health. So we can record that people are eating more fruits and vegetables and actually eating better quality of the same type of food, and I think that's really important to say. And I also have an opportunity, a bit like the food banks, you can use the affordable food club as that anchor where you can then shape different things and wrap around care around that. So you can have, for example, a food pantry that's got a community kitchen next door to it. It's a good way of inviting men into men's groups because you can actually do a bit of shopping. After school is a really good example where lots of people pick kids up. And at the moment, I think it's fair to say, Andrew, that most of the affordable food clubs are acting as a replacement for that expensive corner shop. Going forward, my ideal would be that they become a real challenger in the marketplace in terms of being able to go there and do a whole weekly shop with more choice and more foods on offer. So that's what I'm hoping is to come. I'll keep Andrew's toes firmly to the fire on that. Because wouldn't it be lovely if you could go to your community affordable food club, whichever form that took, and actually get your whole weekly shopping? So not only are you shopping in your community, you don't have the transport fees and costs, but you're also reinvesting back into your community. So it's almost like a circular economy, which I think would be really good. And let me just finish by saying St. Chad's, if no one's ever gone there, St. Chad's is based in Gateshead. It's an absolutely fantastic organization. I'm actually their ambassador. They have a, they call it a market. I suppose you'd say it was a social supermarket would be the closest way I could think of identifying it. It looks like a whole meal food store. It looks like one of those really posh, fancy stores when you go in it. It looks really brilliant, and it's absolutely jam-packed. It's only been open a few months, and I think it's already 1,000 members, Andrew, something like that. And you have freezers there that have a choice of food. You can buy washing detergent, nappies, as well as all of your food stuff. But again, it's the model at St. Chad's. They have a men's mental health and well-being group. They have a gardening group. They have an art group. They run the holiday activities and food program there. They do all of these other groups. So it ties in, so it becomes a real community resource.
Indeed, and picking up on the importance of Des's comment that I've just picked up in the chat box there, I think I'm right in saying that at St. Chad's, like many other of the affordable food clubs, you could have as little as £1 in your pocket, which, let's face it, is the reality for all too many people in the communities we seek to serve. And yet, in return for that £1 contribution, you still have that choice of goods that you're going to take home with you.
Correct. St. Chad's, I have to say, because obviously I'm their ambassador, they are a bit of an outlier. Most of the social or affordable food clubs do charge a little bit more than that, but St. Chad's says because of the area they're in, they've held the line of £1. And what's really good is you could actually drive and shape behavior. So for your pound, you can actually color code the type of items that you can take free. I think it's 5 items. I'm sure I'll be corrected in the chat if I'm wrong, that you can take for £1. But you can kind of like behaviorally nudge appropriate to the community and the culture of people that live in that community, actually healthy food choices. So you're actually saying, how can you shop on a low amount of money, but try and eat as healthily as possible? And of course, all the work that St. Chad's do around cooking and that upskilling people in cooking really fits in nicely into that whole kind of person-centered approach that they adopt.
Absolutely. And James, before I'm tempted to introduce a 4th area of shared work, should Greta and I wrap up our dialogue within 5 or 10 minutes and open up the wider conversation to the group?
What we could do, I've got some questions I could ask you now, and you can just carry on a conversation if you wanted to, if that works for you.
That's good.
Brilliant.
Yeah, so I'll put it in order of upvotes. So the most requested question to be asked is from Janie Darcy, who's a social prescriber in Blyth, and she's asked, I live and work in Blyth, and it's an area that struggles with socio-economic deprivation. Are there any holiday clubs or provisions in that area, or are there any plans to offer something similar? Does anyone know? She works with a lot of families that struggle with older children in school breaks.
You want me to take that one, Andrew?
Well, I mean, given you live there and given that Northumberland Council are a brilliant HAF provider, over to you.
Yeah. So everybody, I live in Blyth. So I live in a working town. I'm very proud to say I live in Blyth. I will tell everybody that I live in Blyth. I now live in the slightly posher part of Blyth, but I haven't always lived in the posher part of Blyth. For anyone on the call that knows where Sussex Street is down near the bus station, that's where I first lived when I was in Blyth. So not the posh part. So I've got a good handle on Blyth. My actual husband has lived in Blyth for 54 years. So we kind of know it well. I now regard it as my town. I've lived there for 20 years. I'm proud to say I live in Blyth, as you can probably tell. I tell everybody that I live in Blyth. So thank you that somebody else lives in Blyth. The person to contact, and I'll give James the email address. Oh yeah, Blyth Posse. Oh yeah, Blyth. Let's go. Is Amy Richardson at northumberlandcountycouncil.gov.uk. But I'll give the email address to James. And yes, there is HAF provision in Blyth. There we go.
Thank you, Greta. A great answer. Have we got time for a second question, or would you like to move on, Andrew?
No, I mean, just to pause at that point, James, before we open up the wider conversation, the three programmes that Greta and I have been describing, so bespoke help for children, young people and their families and holidays, #1, co-locating services around citizens, #2, and developing within the Feeding Britain network alone, 430 of those affordable food clubs, are playing at least a contributing role in the data that we've started to see now over the past 2 years in particular. Because for many of us on the call, I'm sure there was something of an annual tradition for much of the past 10 to 15 years, whereby each new round of data published on food bank usage was hitting another unwelcome record high, or was registering another unwelcome record increase. It took on this grim inevitability year on year. Well, for the past 2 years, within the Trussell Trust network, there's been a reduction of nearly 1/5 in the number of emergency food parcels given out. And last week we had government data for all food banks suggesting last year 200,000 fewer children and 100,000 fewer working age adults used a food bank. So we may just be starting to turn the tide thanks to these programmes, but also the wider changes we've seen in social security, most importantly. But James, just performing a full 360, coming back to historical roots here in the northeast of much of this work. It was around this time in the spring of 1902 that the Cooperative Women's Guild opened up the People's Store, as they called it, in a very poor part of Sunderland, where under one roof they offered affordable, nutritious groceries, cooked meals, both to take home and to eat there on site, a range of co-located services, a penny bank to save into as well, and nigh on overnight they had 400 local families, the very poorest families, sign up for this venture because they had seen, the Cooperative Women's Guild, and in speaking with residents there, that the cooperative movement as it had existed in Sunderland was working for sort of lower middle class and skilled working class families, but was not benefiting the very poorest. And so that kind of model that I've just described there from Sunderland, you may see permeating through some of this stuff to this very day. So having performed that full 360, James, let's have a wider conversation.
It sounds like a plan to me. Before we take some more questions from the panel, from the Q&A, I was reflecting on a direct quote we got from one of our local listing conversations that we had across the north. I'm going to read out the quote, and I'd love to know kind of how it chimes with you both. So the quote is this: "It was a depressing half hour with the MP. Food banks. The people in those queues are old and beaten. Politicians don't understand them." What would you say to that?
Do you want me to go first, Andrew?
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
I think it's true for some politicians. I think other politicians do understand it, but I think it's very difficult because when we talk about, and this is something I'm always reminding people in my lab, when we talk about lived experiences, it's really easy to say all poor people have the same lived experience, which we know is not true, right? Everybody has their own individual lived experience. Each family has their own individual experience. And whilst there are similarities, there's also differences. So I think we have to be careful in how we present information to parliamentarians in particular. And I think that sometimes the collective voice of working across different sectors, almost like we did for the holiday activities and food, means that actually everyone's individual experience, or when we're co-designing with young people, their individual and designing for different young people is taken into account. But there's a collective voice of the similarities of experience that allow then parliamentarians to actually go forward in a trusted relationship with communities, but actually get right the correct solutions nationally that have what I call flexible sides that can be implemented locally. And I think that's something that's really important. But before I say anything else, I'm just going to reply to Andrew because we're going to differ on something, James, right? It's good to have a bit of difference, right?
It's good.
So when I look at the food bank and food pantry or affordable food club data, I think there has to be a caveat in what Andrew's saying, because I've looked back over the last decade and it's been going up all the time. Now, this is the second small blip where that number's gone down, and it is quite a small blip. It's good, it's encouraging, but that's not enough for any statistician to say we have reversed that trend. Yes, the government's done some really good welfare reforms that probably most people on this call know about, you know, the 2-child limit, etc. But we've also got the Iran war that's happening, and we know that food and fuel inflation is going to go up. That's going to drive the interest paid on mortgage, etc. And nobody really knows how that's going to level out yet in communities. So whilst it's encouraging, I think we've also got a long way to go, because my goodness, we should not be one of the wealthiest countries that has to look at either food banks or another type of food aid, as in affordable food clubs for people. Everybody should be able to afford to go and purchase food in a normative way that everybody does. And I'm just putting it out there because I think it's really important that we keep a close eye on the figures, because everything is quite volatile in terms of the economic picture.
A reason I hesitated before answering was that my answer will inherently be biased. Having worked for Frank, I'm shaped by the experiences of 10 to 12 years ago that I've shared with you today, because he instinctively got it, he instinctively cared, and the moment that one of these new things, as they were then called, a food bank, asked whether he could come and talk to them about this hunger that was emerging in Birkenhead, he was there like a shot. So of course I'm biased in saying he got it and he cared. But beyond that, once Frank was thinking through what could be done in response to this new evil of hunger in British society, he and I were looking at some of the debates in the House of Commons chamber at the time, and there was some of that usual unwelcome mudslinging, point scoring, it's your fault, no, it's your fault, and it was advancing the debate no further whatsoever, while more and more people were being hungry. So what he identified was a cross-party group of MPs and peers who, like him, were concerned about investigating what was driving this new evil and how we could respond to it through changes in policy and practice. So we were very fortunate to pull together that all-party or cross-party group who did care and who were interested. Fast forward much nearer the present day, one of those MPs was Liz Kendall, who chaired our Feeding Leicester partnership in her home constituency, her home city of Leicester. And having chaired Feeding Leicester for, 5+ years, it was Liz who secured a manifesto commitment from the government to work toward ending the mass dependence on emergency food parcels from food banks. No such commitment, to my knowledge, had been made by government or a party aspiring to government before that at a UK level. And as Greta touched upon there, while we can look at the year, 18 months since then, and see perhaps some tentative first steps in the right direction, our message to them is clear. That is welcome, but the job ain't done by any stretch of the imagination. Still, far too many people are having to rely on emergency food parcels from food banks, so you've got to keep your foot on the accelerator if you're to come close to meeting that welcome manifesto commitment.
I'm going to jump in here, James, all right? Perhaps the better ask, Andrew, would have been ending the need for food aid.
Step by step, let's break off an objective that could at least be within reach, because it's going to be hard enough simply to end the mass dependence on emergency food parcels, isn't it? As you've said, given the volatility in the world at the moment, meeting that manifesto commitment alone will be hard enough, let alone anything even more ambitious, which we'd all love to see.
No, agreed. I'm just catching up on the Q&As, and the second most requested question to come into you both is from Frankie Proctor. The question is this: do the speakers think that parents might not access help due to concerns that their competence as a parent may be questioned? Competence in brackets, obviously. And if so, how do we change this? How do we change this sort of feeling of, I can't come to you because I'm a bit ashamed, or I feel like I've not done a good enough job, or whatever it might be?
Hopefully justifiably, James, I'm going to use that question to segue into that fourth area of shared work that Greta and I have been undertaking, Greta, on the under-registration rates for free school meals. I know you led a very powerful research project here in Newcastle, speaking with parents around, again, that folly of having shared their information with one government agency, say the DWP, to claim universal credit, but then being told they've got to speak to another government agency to access free school meals for their children, yet another government agency to access Healthy Start, particularly if they have younger children. Would you like to share some details of research you undertook there, and in a welcome way, how lots of our local councils in the North East have responded?
Yes, so in the Northeast, the primary project we led was on looking at auto enrollment for free school meals. Because one of the things I think I'm looking at Frankie right here. I'm come back to your question in a bit as well, Frankie. I haven't forgotten you. Was actually kind of like the stigma and shame of having to even apply at the school for a free school meal, because if you're applying it at school, people kind of know what you're doing. The other thing that came back from other parents was the schools would keep sending out letters reminding everybody to apply for free school meals, and the parents were saying to me, well, they can't be very good then, can they? Because they keep pushing it so hard. Why aren't people signing up? And so we looked at an auto enrollment, and that was I've just recently presented that at Resolve Poverty, where basically the local authority matches different data sets together. I think that's the easiest way of saying it. And from that, they established there was about 10 to 11% across the Northeast of children and young people who were actually entitled to free school meals but hadn't registered for them. And what the system then enabled the local authority to do is contact the parent or the guardian directly to see if they'd like to be enrolled, and the council actually enrolled. If they said yes, the council then actually enrolled them. So they took that kind of burden off them, because to me, I think school meals should just be a right, and if it's a right, you shouldn't have to apply for it. But that's me and my ivory tower perhaps. So I think there's things that can be done. I think if I look at HAF as a different time, I think when HAF first came out, like most programs when they're introduced, I think it did have a kind of feeling of like, I'm going to be judged about my child, or I'm going to be judged at going there. But as the program has become embedded, I think that stigma or that worrying that I'm going to be judged is really reduced down. And I don't hear it now. I did hear it in the first few months that parents were a little bit worried. I remember when the first project, before we even got to HAF, you can see it on my web page. So I'll ask James to share it with you, because there's a video of a young mum. And I remember when I presented this, so this relates to what you were saying about the parliamentarians. It was a young mum and she had 7 children. And everybody said to me, you can't use that young mum in your video because people will make judgments. And I asked the young mum, I said, do you want to be in the video? And she said yes. And I said, well, you're in. You were part of the research. You have every right to be here. And she found that for her, the program, because it was such an open program and there was so many activities and her children enjoyed it so much, it wasn't necessarily about her and her childcare, or how she was taking care of her children, or the poverty that she was living in. And she really saw it as an opportunity program for herself. She actually went to college after she enrolled in the program and is doing really well now. I've kept in contact with her, and that was many, many years ago. And so I think that there sometimes can be a bit of stigma and shame about the programs, but most of the programs are actually now driven, and Andrew will tell you I'm always talking about this. I'm saying don't market the programs, let the participants and the users market the programs, because they know it best. You do not have to do government marketing around programs. One of the things I would like to see about HAF is at the moment, okay, I'm just going to say it, Andrew. So at the moment, the children that are eligible for HAF are those on means tested free school meals. In September, we have an uplift to free school meals, that we're going to have an extra category of people where free school meals are going to be anyone on universal credit is going to be eligible if their children are of school age for free school meals. But currently, under the policy, those same children whom the government deemed should be eligible for a school meal during term time will not be eligible for half. Go figure. So you can tell where I'm going with this, and I'm going to be really loud and noisy about it, because to me, if the government decides that you may not register, you may not take up the free school meal, but you are entitled to register for a free school meal during term time, and given that half was born out of those same children not having a meal during the holiday period, I cannot understand how children that are on free school meals through universal credit not being eligible for half meals during the holiday period. Watch this space. You'll see me shouting about this from the rooftop, because it's confusing for parents, right? Because when you register for a free school meal, you don't necessarily know which band of funding it's coming down in from government, and nor should you. Your child is entitled to a free school meal. If the half eligibility criteria is for those children on free school meals, then those children, to start off with, should be entitled to half. What I'd ideally like to see is that, because HAF has been running long enough now, HAF clubs are located in communities where there is need. Communities know best where the need is. They're already there. So for goodness sake, just open up in those communities and let all children and young people that live in those communities access HAF. Let's get going. Come on.
So just as it was those voices from here in Newcastle in the Northeast in 1909 calling on the government to extend new term time eligibilities into the holidays, so I think we'll be repeating that formula throughout 2026 for the reasons that Greta's just given. And Frankie, a part of my answer to your question would be something we're trying to develop with the NHS Business Services Authority, which of course, again, is based here in Newcastle, because we're trying to get to the stage where the information that parents have shared with the DWP to claim universal credit could in turn be shared by the DWP with the NHS, who can then proactively contact those eligible families with a letter to say, look, it is your right to receive the Healthy Start cards. We've found that you're entitled to it. Just tick the box at the bottom of this letter, return it to us, and you will get your Healthy Start card, and you can start using it to support your family, because it is your right to do so. We hope that could strip out so much of the complexity and potentially some of that stigma that currently could exist and gets in the way of parents accessing their support to which they're fully entitled.
Correct. Totally agree, Andrew. James, you're on mute. I've always wanted to say that to James. It's so exciting.
There you go. I finally succeeded in failing. Thank you very much. Yes, I'm back in here. So looking at the time, I think we probably should be putting an end to this conversation, unfortunately, now. But we would just like to say thank you so much to Greta and Andrew for coming on and basically exploring all the amazing avenues they've gone down over the years. I think, the conversation about the HAF, the conversations that then led to, the co-located services was really, really inspiring and hopefully educational, and getting people thinking, we can do this in our area too. So this is not something that just happens where it's happened. It can happen in other places too. And I think then talking about affordable food clubs and pantries, in addition to and alongside, or in sense of, in sort of to replace almost the food banks, is really, really good way of looking at things and a more positive way of looking at things. And I think what you've both shown so far throughout your careers, and certainly today, it's that everything starts at grassroots. It then leads to policy. It then leads to practice. And then most importantly, it comes back to the people. It's that power of collective action across different places. It's the importance of lived experience alongside research. And it's the fact that this work is ongoing and evolving. It's not a, we did this. It's, we did this, but we're still doing this. And this is what we're going to do next. This is what's happening next. And it's the idea, that simple idea of a simple conversation can lead to change. And that brings us back to a previous comment that was made when we had a Cormac Russell for a webinar last month or the month before. And I think it's just a really nice way to kind of, button off everything here. And so all I'd like to say now is we have a couple more webinars lined up So we have, let me double check what I'm about to say. So we have on the 21st of April at 2 p.m, we have an In Conversation with Professor Mark Tudor Jones. He is a world-renowned planner, and it will all be about who really shapes place. And so this conversation really looks at, when planning applications go in, when local plans are made, when roads are built, that decides what happens, when it happens, and why it happens. It's a really big conversation that needs to be had, and we're very much looking forward to doing it. The second or the third webinar this month will be with Candice Randall from Bridale House. She's a social entrepreneur, and this conversation is all going to be about prevention, not cure, about rebuilding communities from the ground up. And so the Mark Tudor Jones webinar is currently on our Eventbrite page and on our website, peoplespowerhouse.org.uk. The Candice Randall webinar will be added to Eventbrite by the end of the week. That's all I have to say. I'd just like to thank again everyone for joining us on this call. I'd like to thank everybody for the really interesting chats and shared experience and shared ideas you've put within the chat. Has been really, really helpful and useful. And I hope you can all take something out of this. I hope someone's able to get back to Fozia and give her some help and support and ensure that the great work she's doing continues. And also, finally, I'd like to once again thank Greta and Andrew for a fantastic conversation. We're thrilled that you came to join us, and we're consistently inspired by the work that you do. So thank you very much, and I'll say goodbye. Thank you.
Across the North, people care deeply about where they live. They want to be part of the conversations that shape their lives.
For me, being heard means an actual start of a change in the community.
So maybe they can do things better and help local people and have new ideas as well.
I think there's definitely a community spirit in the North.
I just wish people would listen to us.
I think it's so important to spark conversation, because you never know what someone else is going to do with it. You never know how far that's going to travel. I just wish people would realise their own power.
People's Powerhouse isn't about politics, it's about getting opinions, and every opinion counts.
People's Powerhouse was set up very quickly in response to a growing feeling that most of the narrative about the North was around physical infrastructure, and it felt like the in-between places and the people weren't really featuring in that conversation. We were inundated, and literally hundreds and hundreds of organisations and people got in touch. I think because we just hit a nerve in a positive way, which was to say, actually, there's a lot to say about what's good, about what people get together and do in the North.
The North have always had a strong social background, and People's Powerhouse bring that together, bring voices together from across the North.
The goals are to be a trusted, responsible, energy-giving, enthusiastic friend and colleague to encourage people to get their voice across.
Because we believe that better decisions are made when more diverse voices are around the table.
The People's Powerhouse, I think, draws people together to really increase the say that everybody has. And I know the antidote to alienation is participation. And it's about creating that space in which all people across the North can participate in making decisions. And it does that with a real sense of relishing our diversity, of creativity, of energy, of joy, of using a mix of, again, different creative forms of coming together and in different places. And I think it's literally what we need.
So today we ran a session that we are calling Community Conversations. We just invited people along, free teas and coffees, a bit of cake, and just asking people what they would like to hear from the people who represent them. What do they want to know about their area, and in what way would they like to get involved with maybe some of the decision making, and if they feel like they have any say in their area as well.
We give people a voice by making sure that when we do convene, that actually we probably flip the conversation more often than not, so that the people who have got that lived experience, it's their voices that really bring that kind of quality insight into what's really happening, what people are really thinking, and also what's working.
We want people from all walks of life, and people who maybe don't feel that they've got any agency in terms of power, and we will empower people to challenge politicians, but we'll never disrespect them, we'll never make them feel uncomfortable, and we want to continue the conversation because we are working with the people in those positions. However, they now need to recognise that in order to connect, they've got to work much harder.
It feels like we're starting to be listened to a little bit by a little bit. Even with things like this, just interviewing young people, makes us feel heard and like we have our own say, and it gives us a feeling of like power.
Aside from trying to engage with our young people and opening community centres and things like that, that's kind of as far as where our reach goes. But People's Powerhouse, they take it to people who can make change, people who are actually making a lot of the active decisions about things that we just could never hope to change if we tried.
Leaders need to be immersed in spaces that again show us what's possible and remind us that there are other ways of doing things.
Because it's our world, we should really care about whether we're heard, because we want to feel valued, we want to feel respected, we want to feel that what we feel is important.
Because there is a little bit of a gap there. We can be that broker in the middle.
Acting as a bridge between the community and then the higher powers of decision making, and connecting the two to make things more accessible.
For me, being heard means being part of policy, being part of community, feeling at home and seeing people like me higher up.
It gives us hope. It gives us a sense of something's worth working towards. It gives us some shared understanding between us that things can be different. And so the more that we platform good ideas, great stuff that people are doing, it helps to keep people motivated.
We haven't got really strong rules. What we have got is a passion and a commitment. And the more of us that get together to really describe carefully what our North needs to look like, the more likely we are to have success. There is so much social injustice out there, and we want to be a big part in doing something about that. So please stay with us and grow with us.
If I could say one thing to the people in power, it would be come and listen to us and you can learn a lot.